Welcome to Research Renaissance, presented by the Karen Toffler Charitable Trust. Embark on a journey into the forefront of cutting-edge brain science as we feature insightful discussions with a diverse array of guests, from early career researchers pioneering groundbreaking science to influential voices in investment communities, policymaking, and research institutions. Together, we delve into neurological diseases, their causes, treatments, and the quest for cures. Join us in advancing our understanding of the brain and addressing its ailments. Welcome to Research Renaissance. I'm Deborah Westphal, your host and guide through the fascinating future of the brain. Joining me today is Dr. Elena Barbereri, Research Assistant Professor at Northwestern University. Elena is also a 2023 scholar. Today's discussion is focused on primary progressive aphasia, a rare neurological disease that impairs the ability to speak. So let's dive in. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a great honor.
Yes, we have known each other for a little bit of time. We did some kind of preliminary discussions when you get the Toffler Award, but I'm very excited to hear about what you're doing and how your science is progressing. And so very excited to have you today. So your focus research is on what you call PPA, this rare neurological disease that, is kind of progressive, that will cause impairment of language for people. And can you tell us about the disease and what are the major questions that you're trying to answer?
Yeah. So primary progressive aphasia, or PPA, is a neurodegenerative disease. So that means that is slowly progressive. So it gets worse over time, and a little bit like Alzheimer's disease, but it is focused on, so the main domain of impairment is language. And that can be, affecting both the ability to speak, but also to understand language. Speaking is somehow more noticeable, but impairments in comprehension are also pretty common. So we diagnose PPA when there is this slowly progressive impairment of language, and the other cognitive functions, for example, memory or attention, are relatively preserved, at least in the first 1 or 2 years of the disease. And then we diagnose PPA when the aphasia, which is the language impairment, cannot be attributed to, for example, a stroke or traumatic brain injury, because aphasia is also commonly caused by stroke, for example. But in that case, it doesn't progress over time. It's just one-time event, and then people make it better. With PPA, unfortunately, it starts slowly, but it progresses over time. So there are many questions, that we are trying to answer. It's a relatively new disease. I actually am lucky to work with Dr. Mesulam, who is the person who defined PPA for the first time in the 80s. And so at the Mesulam Center where I work, we have a really large database of people with PPA, because we have this longitudinal study that the Mesulam Center has been running for over 20 years now. And so we've discovered a lot about the disease, but there's still a lot that we are trying to uncover. So one of the things that, for example, we're trying to understand is, so why, as opposed to Alzheimer's disease, that is a pathology, like a disease that attacks the entire brain, in PPA, the disease is mostly localized to, or at least at first, it really shows a preference for the left hemisphere. That's where the language is localized, at least in 99% of right-handed people. In left-handed, it could be a little bit different. But our language network is in our left side of the brain. And in PPA, there are some pathologies that are somehow attacking cells mostly in the left hemisphere of our brain. And so we're trying to understand why, some of these this disease is showing preference for the left side versus the right side, for some areas versus others. And also other questions like, so what happens in PPA is that we see there is a reduction of our cortex, so our gray matter. That's like the layer of, when we look under the skull, right? The first thing that we see is what we call cortex, and so there is a thinning of this cortex compared to, for example, people of similar age and similar education, for example, but they don't have the disease. And this we are trying to understand how this what's the relationship, for example, between this cortical thinning or reduction of gray matter and the language symptoms that participants show. And also, how are these areas that show reduction of cortical thickness, how are they functioning? Are they functioning as well as the areas that are not subject to this cortical thinning? Are there other areas in the brain that are compensating for these areas that are subject to cortical thinning? So these are some of the questions that we are trying to answer, but there's much more.
Yeah. Wow. So how, when you say it's a rare disease, I mean, can you give us some sense of what the percentage is, or, is this 1 in 1 million people? How rare is this?
I can't remember the number exactly, but it is much less common than Alzheimer's disease. There's also the question, partly the issue is that there's not that much knowledge about it. Like, because it's a recently discovered disease, for example, some of the clinical practitioners are not very familiar with this disease. And therefore, it happens that this is maybe misdiagnosed or underdiagnosed. And also in the public knowledge, this disease is somehow not very talked about. And actually, it's thanks to two recent famous people who were diagnosed with this disease, and they luckily decided to talk about this diagnosis, that people I think are learning a little bit more about it. So, I'm sure you know, Bruce Willis, I think it was a couple of years ago that he was diagnosed with PPA. He never really said that he had PPA, actually. He said that he had aphasia. And then I think after a few months, they came out saying that he had frontotemporal dementia. And usually that's because, there's some sort of, it's hard to communicate this diagnosis correctly, I think. But the bottom line is that he has primary progressive aphasia. And then now recently, it's been Wendy Williams, who also came out and said she had primary progressive aphasia. So actually, thanks to these celebrities who disclose their diagnosis, I think it's becoming a little bit more, there's more public knowledge about it. But I think, in many instances, we actually hear from our patients who maybe go through like 1 or 2 years of different consultations with different clinical providers before, actually succeeding in being correctly diagnosed. So it is an issue still of, people not really knowing the disease, including the clinicians.
So you mentioned strokes, because it can, it can
Mhm.
be master. And I think you did some of your early work with stroke.
Mhm. Right.
Why? Because, and then I'd like to ask a couple questions more about how that's different. But why did you move to PPA as far as your research? What was the interest there?
Well, I've always actually, okay. So originally, when I was studying, so I did my PhD in Italy, and I was working with a professor, Claudio Luzzatti, who was an expert in aphasia, but he had an expertise on stroke aphasia, and so that's why he was seeing these patients, and then I became passionate. He was talking about like aphasia in one lecture, and that's when I actually learned that I was really interested in the relationship between language and the brain. And so then I really wanted to work with him, and that's what I got exposed to first. And then when I came to Northwestern as a postdoc, I was working under Cindy Thompson. She's an expert on aphasia, but both stroke aphasia and primary progressive aphasia. She was collaborating with the Mesulam Center, where I am now, and with Dr. Mesulam. And so, thanks to that opportunity, I was exposed to primary progressive aphasia as well, and I started like being interested in the disease. And then actually, it just happened that the lab where I was before, Cindy Thompson retired, and so I just happened to come here and work here. And yeah, and it's been actually very interesting because so we study the disease to understand the brain better in some cases, right? So there's still a lot of debate, for example, about language and where is it localized in the brain, which parts of the brain are involved in language and in which aspects of language. Language is such a complex faculty that, when we speak, we don't really think about how many steps we go through, in order to actually have a conversation, from like finding the right word to put the words together in a sentence, and then or understand when we try to understand someone speaking, from like analyzing the speech sounds to connecting those speech sounds to a meaning, and then integrating the meaning of different words together. So it's a very complex cognitive function, and it also happens that only humans really have language developed in a way that is so complex. And so it's fascinating to like study stroke aphasia and PPA as a model, to understand better how language is organized in the brain. Because the diseases are so different, we actually somehow occasionally draw different conclusions. So there are still, some aspect, for example, of language comprehension that, so if we do a certain study with a group of people who have stroke, and then we do it with people with primary progressive aphasia, we see that, the same function correlates with slightly different areas. And we are trying to understand why that happens. It's just because the two diseases are different. And because, for example, in stroke is a huge sudden event that affects, in most cases, a large chunk of the brain. And it affects both the gray matter, which means, the body of the brain cells, basically, but also it largely affects white matter, which are the connections between different cells and different parts of the brain. And in PPA, it's different because it starts small, usually. And so there is atrophy affects mostly the gray matter, so the bodies of the brain cells, but only later, or in some cases, but not to the same extent as in stroke, the white matter. And so the connections may be more preserved. And so that's why we can see slightly different outcomes when, the same region is affected, the same region is damaged. The damage is, a different severity. And B, there is the issue of, the extent to which the connections are damaged, which is large in stroke and much less in primary progressive aphasia. So it's really fascinating.
Yeah. So how does it, when it's misdiagnosed, is it misdiagnosed as a stroke? Is it misdiagnosed as something else? There's people maybe walking around with this that maybe if they knew that there was this other thing, they could help their doctors, kind of explain maybe what's going on. I don't know, but how is it misdiagnosed mostly?
Yeah, it's mostly misdiagnosed with other types of neurodegenerative diseases, like, for example, Alzheimer's disease. Because, like most likely what happens is that the person says maybe they cannot find the words or they are forgetting things. But, a lot of the things that we try to remember or we are things that we are trying to tell someone else. And if your language is impaired, it's hard to sense if memory is impaired or not in some cases. So it is, from like the patient recalls or like the care partners, their spouses, their relatives, when they're describing the difficulties that the person encounters in everyday life, sometimes they say, oh, he doesn't remember things. But then when you really dig deeper, in primary progressive aphasia, that's not exactly the case. It's that they cannot tell you, maybe, because they don't remember the words. But if you present them pictures, for example, and you ask them to remember those, they are fine. They remember it, as well as people of the same age who don't have the disease. So it's, in many cases, just because you maybe in a standard like neurological exams, there's like maybe a little bit more focus on general cognition and not, you're not picking up the language nuances of the disease. And therefore it may be misdiagnosed as Alzheimer's disease. It is harder to misdiagnose the disease as stroke, because you can do an MRI, and the MRI is going to tell you if you had a stroke. You can see it on the MRI. And then also the other main difference is that in stroke, the onset of these language deficits, it's sudden. So it's just right away. And the person usually, lose consciousness, not necessarily always, but it is more likely that it's like an event that everybody noticed, or, because the person fell down, or they lost consciousness, or they showed some other symptoms. They couldn't talk at all, or they had some hemiplegia, so they couldn't move one side of their body. So with stroke, it's just easier to detect. But it's usually misdiagnosed with other forms of neurodegenerative disease, one being Alzheimer's disease, the other being frontotemporal dementia. Because sometimes people with frontotemporal dementia also may have slight difficulties maybe with language, like they're a little bit less fluent, but their main problems are with other aspects like behavior, for example. So that could happen as well.
So this is not a dementia. This is something that's separate. Is that correct?
It is still a dementia. We call it like a language dementia because it just focus. So there are different types of dementia. Like, for example, in Alzheimer's disease, that's memory is the first and primary domain that is impaired. In frontotemporal dementia, there is, for example, it's behavior of frontotemporal dementia, that's behavior. So there's like other issues. In PPA, it's language.
So I would imagine, I mean, if you can use an MRI for stroke to see what's going on in the brain, you can't really do that for PPA. What are the challenges that are kind of exist when you're studying this disease? What kind of challenges and what kind of technology do you use or techniques do you use to try to understand it?
Yeah, so actually, MRI is useful because you can see sometimes, not necessarily always, but especially if the disease is somehow advanced, you can see even on your naked eye, you can see atrophy, you can see the brain shrinking. So you can see like the folding between different parts of the brain to become larger. There are the ventricles, which are those, like, there's some kind of empty spaces. They're filled actually with the cerebral spinal fluid, but they become larger. And then the folding between the gyri of the brain is somehow folding on itself, and those are become like larger. And so you can see it on the MRI that you can see the atrophy on the naked eye. There's also other techniques that you can use. So sometimes we can see, for example, the atrophy much, And so one other method that we use is, for example, FDG PET. So it's another type of neuroimaging that basically images how, like, our brain metabolism. So how much glucose, how much sugar our brain uses. And so it gives us an idea of how well some areas of the brain are functioning. So sometimes it happens that you cannot see the actual brain shrinking, but you can see that in some areas there's less function than expected using FDG PET, for example.
Are there advances in technology that you kind of wish would, that are emerging or you wish would accelerate that would help you do your job?
Yeah, I mean, definitely there have been significant advances, like two of these being what we call amyloid PET and tau PET scans. So these are mostly mentioned in relation to Alzheimer's disease. But so I think I have to explain something in the background. So PPA can be due to different pathologies. So by pathologies, I mean usually proteins that accumulates in the neurons and then eventually lead the neurons to death. And so that's what's behind the atrophy, so the shrinking of the brain, right? Because there are cells that are dying because of these proteins that accumulates in the nucleus or outside the nucleus of the cell and then eventually lead to neuronal death. And these type of proteins can be different in PPA. There are several that can cause PPA. And two of these are the same that also underlie Alzheimer's disease, Alzheimer's dementia. So these two are amyloid and tau. And for these two, because I guess Alzheimer's disease is so much more common and there's also much more funding, or it's such a public, it's really public knowledge and an emergency somehow. So we have developed two different scans. They're still PET scans. So there is a tracer that you inject in the arm, and then you put the person in a sort of scanner that is similar to an MRI scanner, and then you can see which part of the brain are picking up that tracer. And so those parts of the brain are where the amyloid or the tau proteins are accumulating. So that's very useful because it can tell you, especially tau PET scans, I think are becoming much more important because we are figuring out that for Alzheimer's disease, those may be more telling of when the person is starting to become to develop symptoms, because amyloid can occur also in normal brains. But it seems that when tau is picked up by these tau PET scans, that could be it's an important biomarker of Alzheimer's disease. And so, yeah, in PPA, we have amyloid and PET to identify those people who have PPA due to the same type of neuropathology underlying Alzheimer's dementia. But for the other ones, we don't have specific tracers that can help us identify and discriminate between the other types of neuropathologies. And that's really important because PPA refers to a phenotype, so to a clinical presentation of someone who has problems with language, but the cause is very different. So it could be, as I said, the same type of neuropathology underlying Alzheimer's dementia, but it could also be other types of proteins accumulating, and those may be associated with different symptoms and also should follow a different path of care. Because if you have PPA that is due to Alzheimer's disease, then you can think that you can, for example, give these people the same medication that you give to people with Alzheimer's disease. But certainly you don't want to give those medication to people who don't have this type of neuropathology. I mean, we don't really have anything else for the other people at the moment. But it's really important, actually. These scans have really provided a step forward because of this ability to tell based on these scans, okay, maybe I should give this medication that is designed for Alzheimer's disease to this person, but not to this other person. So it's really important.
I'm very curious. We have a couple other, the trust has a couple scholars that are studying early, in youth, very young people, language or how they learn or how they recognize faces or, just kind of that development. Is there, to your knowledge, or, where are we at with the science? Is there a connection with early development of language and the, onset or the PPA as it develops? Is it hereditary? Do we know this?
So there are in some cases, PPA seems to have a genetic basis, but really only a small percentage of cases. And with respect to the developmental diseases, actually, so Sandra Weintraub, she's a professor here at the Mesulam Center. She's a clinical neuropsychologist, and she published a couple of papers. She studied at least one family in our database where there was this woman who had PPA, and then she had 9 siblings, and 7 of these 9 siblings had developmental language disorders. So there is this hypothesis that there could be some family based like weakness of the language network in some families, and then this weakness is somehow vulnerability is somehow expressed in some members of the family as a developmental language delay or difficulties, could be dyslexia or other things, and then in some other members it expresses as PPA. But I think we don't really know. I'm pretty sure in their paper they didn't identify a specific gene associated with this family, for example. So yeah, there's still a lot to do in terms of identifying possible genetic causes. The known one are limited. So it seems like only among the genes that we know, they cause PPA only in a small percentage of cases.
We just don't know.
Many things, they still need to be discovered.
Yeah. It's pretty amazing. The center was stood up, just in the 1980s. And in research time, that's not a lot. That's still very new. Can you talk about the center? Can you talk about, what its mission is? What is, the day-to-day, kind of the people that are working there? Yeah, tell us about that.
Yes. So the center was founded in 1994 by Marcel Mesulam and Sandra Weintraub. And so they were recruited from Harvard, and they came here and they founded the center. And also we have the Neurobehavior Memory Clinic. There's clinicians seeing patients, and that specializes also in neurodegenerative disease. So the mission of the center is really to better understand and eventually, with the hope of eventually curing this disease, of course, all neurodegenerative diseases. So from Alzheimer's disease to PPA, there's a huge focus on PPA because, as I said, Dr. Mesulam is the one who first identified this disease. So the program is going strong. And the center has, is a really unique environment because there's so many different investigators that have wildly different backgrounds, but they have a common goal, which is to better understand neurodegenerative diseases. And so some of these professors, they are pathologists, for example, so they do autopsies, they cut these brain slices, they look under the microscope, they figure out which protein is in is in each part of the brain. And then others are clinical neuropsychologists. So they really focus on the assessment of cognitive functions, of memory, of language, of attention. And then we have a speech pathologist. For example, she is helping us with a study where we are trying to provide some sort of speech language treatment for people with PPA. We have neurologists, like behavioral neurologists. They divide their time between the clinic and the center. And then we have like cognitive neuroscientists like myself. So really like focusing on neuroimaging and, the relationship between brain and behavior using different techniques. And then we have also social workers because, of course, all these diseases also come with a huge burden, not only on the patient, but also on their care partners, spouses, relatives, families. And so we have a team of social workers that work with our participants. So when our participants are recruited into our program, they also meet with the social workers, and they are followed by them to really help them navigate all the implications of this disease and all the difficulties that arise. So because of course, some of these PPA is also a young onset disease, I should mention. So like the average onset of our patients is probably in their early 50s. And so, most of these people are working and they have to stop working. There's like filing for disabilities, there's like issues regarding long-term care, decision making, power of attorney, and really our team of social workers is helping them with all of this. So the motto of the center is from cell to social work, because we are trying to cover all the aspects of the disease. And so in this case, in this sense, the center is a really unique place. You can really draw from everybody's expertise and learn so much.
Now, are you a clinician too? Do you see patients?
So I used to be. That's in when I was in Italy. I trained first as a clinical neuropsychologist. It's a little bit of a different system. So I was able to practice as a clinical neuropsychologist after my master's, because that's how we get certified, and then we can take the board exam and then practice. And then, however, in the meantime, I decided also to do a PhD, and then the PhD was in cognitive neuroscience, and then that's when I got really passionate about doing research. And then I had the opportunity to come here to Northwestern, and then practicing here was a difficult route to take, because I should have basically gone back and gotten a different PhD in clinical neuropsychology, and so it was a little too much. So
too much workload, or too much what?
Too many PhDs. I think one is enough, for a lifetime. Some people get two, but I don't know how they do.
Yeah. So what is the prognosis, or, kind of the long term with people that suffer with this disease? Is there still longevity, or is this something that also affects them kind of secondary, or there's consequences of this? Because it would seem if you don't have language, that's really horrible. But does it affect other things in their life, in their longevity and quality of life?
Yeah. So unfortunately, I mean, of course, at the beginning, the diagnosis is linked to its being selective to language for the first 1 or 2 years, and that, of course, already comes with a lot of impairment, because we use language for everything. Everything we do in our life is based on our ability to communicate. Almost everything. And so it is already, of course, a huge change for somebody's ordinary life. But then eventually the disease spreads to encompass other parts of the brain and other functions. So as the person progresses through the disease, we see impairments in memory, in attention, behavioral symptoms such as becoming disinhibited, socially inappropriate, or very apathetic, losing interest in many activities. So there's changes that can really affect multiple domains, and the prognosis is like, in terms of how many years. So unfortunately, all these patients, the disease eventually leads to death. But the time that goes between the first symptoms, the appearance of the first symptoms to death can really vary. And it seems that it varies depending on what's the neuropathology that causes the disease. So in some cases, it could be 3 or 4 years. In other cases, it can go up to 15 years. So it really depends. And we also don't necessarily know all the factors that are causing these variabilities. One seems to be the type of neuropathology, but there may be others. And yeah, we just haven't uncovered them all.
Yeah. It's fascinating when you went through all the steps of what it takes to speak and to comprehend. That's, I have never really thought about that because it's just such a natural thing. We learn and we do. And as you were speaking, I was also thinking about just the amount of variation that people have, with accents or, just, however they take the language and use the language is just really fascinating. And what you're saying is we just don't know a lot. We are just starting to kind of open that up and understand how, when you said the center recruits people, like, do you need a lot of people? Is there certain people you're looking for? I don't know. Maybe there's people that will be listening to this that have family members or, how does that work?
Yeah, so we have different strategies to recruit people. So we have a lot of people now because, as I said, we have like this long-standing longitudinal study that has been going on since 1996. So now we have basically 200 people with PPA who took part in our study. It's a huge database. So we are very lucky. But we are still, because there's so many questions that we are trying to answer. And, when like new technology advancements come up, then we incorporate them in the study, right? So now, for example, we are doing these amyloid and tau bets, but 10 years ago, we were not doing them. And so, we are always recruiting more people. And the way we do this is really through different systems. So we try to establish relationship with neurology practices all over the United States. We send letters to like neurologist offices or speech pathologist offices because they may be the first person that, or not the first, but maybe the second or third person they are referred to. And so we let them know about our program. And then there's our website. We have a website that has a lot of information about PPA. So if someone is diagnosed with PPA and search for PPA symptoms or PPA treatment, our website is one of the first that comes up. So on the website, there's all this information about, if you want to participate, who you should contact. And then, there's really the chance to call us. And we typically we collect some medical records. We start working with the person, with the caregivers. Sometimes we have to request medical records from the hospital and really, understand what's the overall, health situation. And then we do a sort of short Zoom call most of the time to really get a sense of how the person is speaking and if it's likely that the person could have PPA and could be at an earlier stage. We're trying to recruit people who are in the earlier stages of PPA. And then, we bring all these results to Dr. Mesulam. He's the one who gives the go ahead for recruiting someone. Nobody knows PPA better than him. So, and then we have the patients, the potential participants, we fly them in. So they usually stay with us for 3-4 days. And during these 3-4 days, they do a variety of things. So they usually always have an appointment in the clinic with Dr. Mesulam where they do like a neurological exam that is really focused on PPA and making sure that their diagnosis is correct. And then they do lots of language testing, testing of other cognitive functions, memory, attention. They do MRI scans. They do scans to see like resting state activity, so how much the brain is connected at rest. We do a special scan called diffusion tensor imaging that actually allows us to visualize the white matter, so the actual structural connectivity between different parts of the brain. We do FDG PET, so visualize metabolic activity. We do the amyloid and tau PETs to visualize these proteins that can be the underlying cause of PPA. And then we do also like a language task when the patient is in the scanner to see when they're listening to language, which areas are lighting up. And so we really have, then we put all this together, and we try to understand what's the picture, so what's the state of the brain function, the cognitive functions. And then we actually then have patients come back every 2 years until they are able to or until they want to, and we just follow their progression. And then in the meantime, we also offer, as I said, this social work support. And also we really inform them about anything related to the disease that they want to know. And recently, we're also actually just about to start a sort of treatment program that incorporates, it's a psychoeducational and speech pathology program. So we are going to have actually 8 weeks of psychoeducation. So that means having group sessions with the patients and their care partners, spouses, or whoever is the primary caregiver. And then they're going to have like 8 different lectures that address every single problem that is associated with living with PPA. And then after this phase of psychoeducation, then we'll do speech therapy with the patients and also teach some communication strategies to their caregiver to make sure that they can better communicate. Sometimes, the person who takes care of the individual living with PPA has issues knowing how to react when the person cannot find a word, cannot understand a word. We are not really trained to do this. Language is something so unnatural to most of us and so automated that is really hard if you're not trained somehow in language disorders to know what to do, what's the right thing to do when the person is struggling to, find a word, to understand what people are saying, how to react when, should you bring the person to a family gathering or is it too overwhelming? And so, we're going to try to incorporate all these aspects and then offer this program, which is going to be completely remote because we have a lot of our patients, because it's a rare disease, they come from all over the United States. So it's important to actually offer this remotely so that even people who have zero access to these resources can be easily reached. So,
yeah, that's wonderful. I know, Alzheimer's Association does that for Alzheimer's families. There's people that there's resources, people you can reach out. I know that there's organizations around autism that do the same thing. And, because people, they don't want this disease, they get this disease. And I would imagine that creates just a ton of stress in families. And so that's wonderful. That's wonderful news. And that you're doing that. Earlier in the conversation, you mentioned the funding, that this disease doesn't get as much attention. It's rare. A lot of people don't even know it exists. I would imagine that it is underfunded. Is that the case? And where does funding and policy, where does it need to go here in the next 3 to 5 years to help understand this disease more and really try to work some of these diagnostic tests in treatments.
Mm-mm. Yeah, I mean, we are somehow lucky at the center because the program has been funded for really many years. And I mean, personally here we have like this really large database of brains, like, really we actually have the brain bank of people who donated their brain and we can look at it. And we have lots of, neuroimaging and so, we are fortunate to actually have lots of work to do that can be done now because we do have the data to analyze and to think about. But obviously, we and the University of California, San Francisco, we are the major centers that study PPA. So I'm sure, in other parts of the United States, and not even mention other parts of the world, yeah, I'm sure that the funding is more of a struggle.
Yeah, I was more curious about the funding needs and any kind of policies that might be needed to change. And maybe we could think about it in, the recent, what's recently out there in the news with Bruce Willis and Wendy Williams. And is there more emphasis being put in this area for understanding the disease? And is there more activity around policy that is being done or needs to be done?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually one direction that we should really go into is to educate more about the disease. I think that some of these like media reports, about these two celebrities who developed PPAs, really just gave me an idea that there's a lot of confusion, associated with these different types of neurodegenerative disease. Is it progressive? Is it not? What is the prognosis? There are really a lot of questions. I think, and most of our patients are really faced with this uncertainty when they receive the diagnosis. So I think some funding should be really spent on like educating the general public and educating the practitioners and making sure that this diagnosis, this differential diagnosis of the different types of dementias somehow reaches also, broadly, like in rural communities and like, small practitioners offices. So that's one way. And the other, which is actually really important, is like we are spending, I think, a lot of effort, but with some difficulties, recruiting people from minorities. So somehow the majority of people in our database and also in other database of centers with, that have a lot of individuals with PPA are mostly almost exclusively white. And we are making a huge effort to reach out to communities, but it is to communities where, they have a Latino prevalence or African American prevalence. And it is hard. And we actually don't know what's the reason for this. Is it because in those communities, the practitioners are even less accustomed to, they know somehow that they don't know much about PPA? Is it because it is, there's some differences. There's some differences in the incidence of the disease according to the ethnicity or race. We actually don't know if this is the case. And so, yeah, one huge effort I think should be put in this direction. There's like a huge wave in terms of, for example, clinical trials for Alzheimer's disease in recruiting people from different ethnicities and races, because of course, there seems to be, for example, a higher prevalence of Alzheimer's disease in African American communities, but somehow it's hard to recruit people into clinical trials. And then, it is really important to make sure that we provide the same level of care independently of the ethnicity or the race. So the same for PPA, we're much behind. So that also is really important. And then there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to understand the brain and the vulnerability of the brain to the disease. And some of this work is really expensive, requires expensive machinery. So even just, an MRI machine is very expensive. So if you want something that you can use for research, has, like a sort of huge, that has enough magnetic strength to visualize the structure of the brain properly, then you need to invest money. And the same is for example, applying transcriptomics and like doing genetic analysis of, genome-wide analysis of seeing to see where genes are expressed in the brain. That's also a huge undertake, and however is necessary to understand, why some areas of the brain are particularly vulnerable to disease. And then there's like also the issue of causation and correlation. So, many of our techniques that we use are based on correlation. So we are trying to figure out, if atrophy in the brain is associated with a certain language disorder, if there is more atrophy in a group of PPA in a certain area, depending on the underlying pathology. But to understand the functioning of the brain itself, and like which areas are involved in different aspects of the language functions, as I said earlier, you really want to have a sort of causal relationship. So now recently, for example, there's this technique, electrocorticography, which is very promising to understand the relationship between the brain and behavior. But it has limitations in its application because you can only do it when the patient is undergoing surgery for a clinical reason. So this is a technique where you have actual electrodes and you stimulate on, they remove a piece of the skull because the patient has to undergo surgery, for example, for a tumor or for epilepsy. In some cases, they remove a small portion of the brain to reduce seizures. And so when these people are undergoing surgery, they remove a piece of the skull, and then there is some groups, for example, at University of California, San Francisco, they are doing this electrocorticography. They are stimulating the part of the brain that is exposed and seeing what happens. So they are asking the patient to speak, and if they can no longer speak, then you can map out which part of the brain exactly on that particular individual are crucial for a certain function. So sometimes they make them play the violin because these are patients who are undergoing tumor resection, and they were musicians, and they have to be, able to play the violin. It's really important for their own lives. Or they make them count and so forth. And that technique, allows you to like really establish causation, right? Because you're stimulating there and you're seeing the effect right away. But even that, requires like lots of funding and lots of resources. So yeah, I mean,
There's a lot of need. Yeah, there's a lot of need. I'm very interested in this, and they're all important, but I'm very interested in how do we fix this issue of our brain banks being very homogeneous and very, Caucasian, and because and very Western too. United States, Europe. There's many different places around the world that, is there, if we had access to that diversity, what would we find? Would we find possibly things that protect the brain in other areas, geography areas, other lifestyle areas, other cultures? Is this a disease of, primarily the United States, and or is it does it manifest in more a greater amount? Is there an environmental aspect to this? So that's I appreciate you bringing that up because it's fascinating how complex this is. What we're limited to is what we have to try to understand. So, kind of as we wrap up here, what is your greatest hope as you think about, what you're doing and where you're going? What do you hope for that will, of course, break through and all that kind of stuff, but realistically, in the next 5 or 10 years, what are you hoping to achieve or that will be achieved with you and your colleagues?
Yeah, I hope that we will understand more what's the relationship between like different layers of the disease. So, like, because we are studying this from different perspectives, So the cellular level, right? So we know that there are these proteins that accumulate, but there's other, and then there's like the level that I study, which is like, which part of the brain are less functioning or are, they show reduced cortical thickness and how that relates to the language. But then, these are all important aspects, but like really putting all of these together and understanding, so, okay, like we have this type of neuropathology that accumulates in this part of the brain because in this part of the brain there is a particular type of cell, because there is a particular type of gene that is expressed in that part of the brain and not in other parts of the brain. And how does this affect the functioning of the cell? So the cells, for example, are communicating with these neurotransmitters. They're chemicals that are passed on between cells. So then there's that level too. And then, how does this, malfunctioning of this group of cells translate into like the more macro level, into this area of the brain not functioning and not communicating with the other parts of the brain? And then how this, like results in the language difficulty. So yeah, I think that we are really doing a lot of steps toward reaching this point. So I'm hoping that in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll have a better answer to this. And then I think when we have this, better understanding, then it will be easier to figure out the cause, what's triggering the whole process. But yeah, we're definitely not there. And I don't think necessarily be in 5 to 10 years in that case. But yeah, learning more about the relationship between these different layers of brain function, I think that's the first important step.
Will AI help with this, with big data to bring things together? Or is it still, do you still have to do the groundwork and the research that you're doing with getting the data before AI can help?
Yeah, when I think about this, I'm not really sure how and to what extent AI can contribute to this. I mean, there's like, many, for example, applying machine learning, to big data has been attempted by, multiple groups, and like maybe figuring out, based on how you speak, what kind of features in your language output, figuring out the diagnosis, what type of PPA the person has. But I don't think so far it hasn't had a lot of success. And then somehow, we are doing, actually we're really focusing a lot on individuals as well, so like really single cases, because sometimes studying one case or two cases really in depth and figuring out all the different, the interaction between these different aspects, for example, structure and function, and then the language output, is just so informative. It is equally as informative as like doing big group studies. I don't have a really good answer on how like AI can help us. Maybe I don't know enough about it, but I think, yeah, for now, we still need to do the hard work and really, yeah, study each individual carefully, and then also try to extract some sort of common patterns, but really also focusing on the individual differences. There's so many cases where the same lesion in stroke or in PPA, the same atrophy, the same part of the brain, results in slightly different outcomes. And then, the question is why?
Thank you for that. So, how would people get a hold of you if they're interested more in the research you're doing, or if they're interested in the study, or they just want to get involved? How would they get a hold of you?
Our website would be the first place, as a first step to really see what kind of research we do, and also if if someone is interested in participating in the study. So our website is www.brain.northwestern.edu. And so that's the website for the Mesulam Center for Cognitive Neurology and Alzheimer's Disease. And then as far as getting in touch with me, my email would be the best. My email is elena.barbieri. It's ELENA, that's my first name, BARBIERI @northwestern.edu. And so, yeah, if you're interested in anything related to the research that I do, volunteering, doing an internship at the Mesulam Center, knowing more about the disease, please feel free to email me.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I know, you're busy, very busy in this research field. I appreciate you spending the time today to go through this disease.
It was wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it very insightful and kind of simplified it. It's a very complex, but simplified it, and thank you for your dedication in this and the time that you're spending. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it, and I think it's really important, because it's going to help spread knowledge about the disease, and so hopefully, people will be listening to this and will know a little bit more about BPA, and hopefully this can help. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you for joining Research Renaissance. For more information and to stay updated, subscribe for more episodes and visit our website at tofflertrust.org. Feel free to call us if you have any thoughts, suggestions, or just want to find out more about the Karen Toffler Charitable Trust. Until we meet again, onward and upward.